Hello, good morning. So as soon as you start talking about Pathumma's goat, Pathummayude Adu, you feel as if you are on an endless voyage. It's a text which, as you read it again and again, gives you more ideas, more readings. Okay. So what I'm trying to do here is just to give you glimpses into it. As you read it, you can find out more. Okay. So the first thing is, don't forget to read the preface. It's a wonderful piece of work where Basheer tells you about the circumstances of the writing of this novel. Okay. Most of the people who know him intimately will tell you, very few are alive today, that he wrote this novel while he was in an asylum for mental patients. Okay. This is one phase in his career. Okay. A certain kind of a bout of insanity or mental derangement, what we call unmadam in Malayalam. Kind of feeling that you get, the kind of highs that you get as if you are drunk, and as if you can't control yourself. Okay. So in fact, writing is one such process, many people say. You lose hold of yourself. You appear to be divinely inspired, which is why Shakespeare put all three together. A poet, a madman, and a lover. All three together. All three standing on the same platform. A kind of frenzy that seizes writers. So in Basheer's case, this had always been with him. Okay. The untrammeled flow of words. This is one thing you realize when you read Basheer's works. You feel that there is nothing contrived about them. It hasn't taken much time for him to write it. Of course, there might be mental blocks, but the writing seems to be in a big flow, in an uninterrupted flow. Okay, the spontaneous overflow of creativity, so to say. So this particular incident in his life of being incarcerated in an asylum for mental patients is a very important thing. And the kind of jokes he cracks while describing the circumstances which led to the composition of the novel. One, for instance, where one of the inmates tells him that he was a soldier in the Second World War in Syria, and he had died 5 years ago. And Basheer said, then how come you are here? He said, God has sent me to the earth again. And Basheer remarks that he didn't ask why. Another inmate had one great wish in his life. He wanted to eat an elephant. So Basheer said, my granddad an elephant, do poopa koranandam. Immediately the inmate asked him, did you eat him? Did you eat it? So such jokes are plenty. And this was immediately after he was married. Okay, this incarceration in the asylum. And he lists a number of people who had come to see him. And about those he was not very sure of, he wrote in brackets, doubtful, samshayam. So among these doubtful visitors was his wife, Fabi Basheer. So there are plenty of such anecdotes. Okay, and it is in this preface that he tells us about what happened when his Dupupa Koranandardu, my granddad had an elephant, was prescribed as a textbook in Kerala. Circumstances which led to the novel being prescribed as a textbook. How it met with violent opposition from a cross-section of the political parties, because it was the first communist government which had conferred this honor on his novel. So there are places. So I think the preface forms part of the text. You can't separate it from the novel. Okay. In fact, there is a continuity. The same style, the same kind of narration, and more importantly, he is talking about his own family, his home, his mother, all the people whom he had known, experienced, associated with during his young age. So that's what he's talking about. Okay. Now, as I said earlier, there is this overlap between autobiography and fiction. This is not something very new, you see. It happens in almost all fictionist case in Malayalam. If you take M.T. Vasudevan's novels, you find that the characters, the milieu are actually his own. Okay. So when he talks about a grand uncle, William Marvin, he's actually in most cases talking about his own William Marvin in the novel or short story. And his milieu, the Valluvanad Taluk of currently the Palakkad district, where he was born and brought up, the village called Kudallur. So this happens, but remember, he gives the characters fictitious names. There is no character called Vasudevan. There is Sedu, there is Govindanunni, there is Appu, all fictitious names, all fictitious characters, but clothed in this verisimilitude between his own life, his own milieu, his own background, his own village. Right. But in this case, in Pathummayude Adu, Basheer does not do that. He is simply narrating events, most of which appear to have actually happened, without disguising either the events or the characters. Right. So the Umma in Pathummayude Adu is his own Umma. The Pathumma, the owner of the heroine, the goat. Okay, as if the goat has no name. We simply know it as Pathummayude Adu. Right. So this Pathumma is Basheer's own sister. We also learned that he had another sister called Anuma. And a number of brothers, I think 4 brothers. One, Abdul Qadir, Hanifa, okay, then Abu, 3 brothers, and these 2 sisters. His father had been long dead. Okay, he was a big timber merchant, and the family was in a much poorer circumstances when the novel begins. All the wealth was gone, all the means of income was gone. He was a big timber merchant, Basheer's father, Abdur Rahman, who used to have trees cut from the high ranges, had them brought to Muatupura, okay, sliced them up, and then sold them for a big price. He was rich, and he was able to give his sons good education. Basheer actually studied in an English medium school, although he dropped out. That's very interesting. Being the eldest son, he was given this opportunity to study, but he dropped out in the 9th standard. Right. So, everything is about his own family. The milieu is familiar, the background is familiar. Right. So this is the first thing you should note. The overlap between fiction and autobiography that happens in the novel. Right. So once this is established, one can look at Basheer as a writer who transgressed this border. Okay. We know that art is nothing but life in another form. In fact, Kakkuzhi-Maliakkal said that art is life and nothing more. Kala jeevitham thanne, he said. So here also, Kala jeevitham thanne. Art is life, nothing but life. And M.P. Paul, who wrote an introduction for Basheer's novel Balyakala Sakhi, went as far as to say that this is torn, these pages are torn from the book of life, and you can see the blood on the edges. ഇത് ജീവിതത്തിൽ നിന്ന് കീറിയെടുത്ത ഏടാണ്. വക്കിൽ ചോര പൊടിഞ്ഞിരിക്കുന്നു. M.P. Paul would say. So, almost everything, I told you the other day, almost everything that Basheer wrote comes directly from his experience. He has not written pure fiction, conjuring characters out of thin air, or, kind of distilling the circumstances and people whom he saw elsewhere. Nothing like that. Most of what he wrote comes from his own experience, which I am not saying is the ideal way to write a novel. No, you can write works, fiction. You can write fiction in many other ways. They need not directly be the result of experience. So many writers conduct extensive research to write a novel. K.R. Meera's Arachar, The Hangwoman, involves months or even years of research into the life of a hangman's family in Bengal. She never experienced what she wrote in the novel. That's another kind of writing. So what I'm trying to say is that in Basheer's case, this was directly taken from his own life. Right. So having said this, one must also remember that Basheer was an untutored muse, almost an unlettered muse. If you realize that he dropped out of school when he was in the 9th standard. Okay. Years later, when he was wandering the length and breadth of India, he would take private tuition for students of MA, students like you. And he was never caught, He was a self-taught man. Okay. So such self-taught men, such independent people have an advantage. They are not indebted to anybody. They are generally more intelligent, more resourceful, never at a loss for words or deeds. So that was what Basheer was. A self-made man. Somebody who could look after himself. Somebody who had learned enough from life. A man of the world who could look after himself. That is Basheer. Okay. Now, right at the outset of the novel, he describes the inmates or residents of his home. So who were they? Not just his mother, his brothers, sisters, or their children. There were other interesting inmates. Hence, who were husbanded. Okay. The two goats, one Pathumma's goat and later on Anuma's goat. The rats in the attic, mice. The squirrels on the trees in the yard. crows, and all kinds of animals and birds, cats for example. So one must remember what Basheer said about all these inmates whom we generally don't mention when we talk about our home. He calls them the inheritors of the earth, Bhumiyude Avagashikal. This term has become very famous in ecological thinking in Malayalam. Bhumiyude Avagashikal. Okay. The inheritors of the earth. So the earth belongs not just to human beings, but to all other beings who exist, who live on the earth. That's why this is the key to contemporary deep ecological thinking. Okay. Deep ecology regards human beings as only one species, not the master species. The earth doesn't belong to human beings alone. The earth belongs to all beings who live in it. So this key vision of Basheer's, ecological vision of his, is first found in Pathummayude Adu. Okay. And the way he treats these beings. For instance, Pathumma's goat had a habit of munching anything it came across. So one day it intruded into the narrator's room and started eating his books. He had copies of all his books stacked up on the table. So the goat reached across and started eating them. And he watched as it ate. He didn't say anything. Then he stared in disbelief as it began to eat the novel Shabdangal, voices. And he asked himself, how dare the goat eat this novel? Or rather, will it dare to eat this novel, Shabdangal? Why? Because Shabdangal was the first novel in Malayalam which described homosexuality. First novel. So will the goat dare to eat it? Okay. One must remember that this was a very controversial novel. Some critics were vehemently against its publication and circulation. A critic called S. Guptan Nair said, if you can call this progressive literature, some people described it as a progressive work. So Guptan Nair said, if you can call this a progressive work, you can call me Mahatma Gandhi. So such violent attacks were common. Right. So this kind of love for fellow beings one finds throughout Basheer's work, especially in this case the goat. The goat was not the only one. He describes a crow which was looking at him, giving him a sidelong glance. And he said, oh, the crow thinks that it has met me somewhere. So there are a large number of passages which describe animals and birds. Okay. So this actually underlines Basheer's ecological vision. His idea that the earth belongs to everybody, not just to human beings. And he was well known for a very interesting act of his. When he drank tea, he was careful to throw away the dregs at the bottom, because he knew that ants would fall into it and drown. So this is what he did every day. When he drank tea, he didn't leave the cup on the table as such. He either threw away the dregs or he washed the cups. But Basheer was well known. Okay, so I'll return after a break. Yeah, welcome back. So Basheer is the eldest son in the family. Okay, one can say the head of the family. But unlike the other heads of the families that you find in Malayalam fiction, he is an entirely different type of person. One is he doesn't rule over the others in the family. He sits quietly. He, instead of appropriating power, he relinquishes power. You know. In fact, the household is looked after generally by his younger brother, Abdul Qadir, okay, who takes charge of all the expenses, okay, who looks after the other members of the family. Okay. His Umma, his mother, looks after the daily routine household things, assisted by her daughter-in-laws. And Basheer, the author, the narrator, just sits quietly in his room, sometimes reading, sometimes listening to music. Occasionally, he becomes the arbitrator when there is a quarrel in the family. Okay, when there is a wrangling either between his brothers or between his sister-in-laws or between his mother and his sisters or sister-in-laws, occasionally, because he is a perfect arbitrator, right? And one also finds not only that he relinquishes power, but he also shares things which are meant for him with other members of the family. So he is back after long years of travel. So his brothers bring him things like bananas, pineapples. Okay, he's older than him and he requires good food. But what does he do? He cuts pieces from it, gives them to his nephews and nieces. Sometimes he feeds the goat. He gives bananas to the goat. Okay, goat is only too happy to have them. So this kind of a humane elder brother. And more interestingly, one also finds that when copies of his books are sent to him, say if he gets 10 copies, okay, he needs only one copy. He sells the other 9 copies. In fact, he sends them with his younger brother Abu to sell. Abu sells them in the market. There are people who are interested in reading Basheer, and mostly he pockets all the money. And we also find that Basheer has some money left with him, money that he has earned working while he was traveling. So everybody borrows money from him. His mother borrows money from him, and finally he gets tired of doling out money. And one interesting aspect of this borrowal was the way women in the neighborhood claimed that he had drunk their breast milk when he was a child. So this is very interesting. Pulla ente mola kudichittundu. He drank my breast milk when he was small. So this notion, how did this happen? Did this really happen? We wonder. Yeah, it did. If you ask old people, they'll tell you. Once upon a time, it was very common for women with small children to feed other children. So if a mother with a small baby visits your home, and if there's a small baby in your home, sometimes just as a matter of routine, she would feed the baby at your home. So this was a common practice in Kerala, of which many people are not aware of. So this actually creates a certain kind of tribal togetherness in society. Okay. So Basheer humorously said, it appears that he had drunk the breast milk of every woman in the village. They would lay claim to his money or his kinship. Okay, so that because he had drunk their milk, he was obliged to help them, doling out money. It's a very interesting event. And even his servant, an old servant, he recollects from childhood, claims that he had drunk her breast milk. Okay. So this is a kind of gesture, humane gesture, which is celebrated. And the sharing business in the home, how everything was shared out. It was a joint family, of course. There were brothers who worked and there were brothers who didn't work at all. Lazy bums. Abu did not work at all. He just went around in fashionable clothes and sandals. So it said that he had 50 pairs of sandals. So he was a big devotee of fashion. Okay. And it was rumored that he had sympathies for the Communist Party. Okay. He was a sympathizer. And Abdul Qadir was a hard-working elder brother. He ran a tin maker's shop. Okay. And he let out things for marriages, vessels, mats, tarpaulin, roofing tarpaulins. And he asked Basheer to give him the gramophone so that he could let it out for marriages. Okay. Hardworking. He went to work early in the morning, he returned late at night. Whereas Abu was downright lazy. Hanifa was also lazy. Okay. He didn't even give anything at home for his own family, for his own children or wife. And there were frequent quarrels between the author, narrator, and his brother Hanifa. So this was the kind of household that you found. And the novel is full of reminiscences of the narrator's childhood. Okay. How his brother, because he was limp from birth, he exploited people's sympathy. And one way he exploited his brother was to ask him to carry his books to school. Of course, he couldn't refuse. So, but he not only asked the author to carry his books to school, he did other things like stealing ghee and sugar and eating. He grew fat because of this. And it was thought that the narrator was the one who stole this. So he was beaten up over and over again by his parents. And even Nangeli beat him up. But ultimately it was discovered that it was Abdul Qadir who had stolen all these from the jars which their mother had kept safely. So such childhood reminiscences are plenty. Okay. Which tell you about both the village, the people, a kind of idyllic village, ideal, nostalgic village. Okay. Peopled by very interesting characters. So this happens over and over again. And when you look at a particular incident in the novel, this was again flashback. The author was away from home. He was then living in Ernakulam, where he had lived for quite some time. He was living in a lodge. He was trying to become a full-time writer. Yeah. Probably the first writer in Malayalam who tried his hand at becoming a full-time writer without doing any other job, devoting his time entirely to writing. So this he did. And when he was living in Ernakulam, his brother visited him. Okay. So his brother was then a school teacher. You know, you could become a school teacher if you had studied only up to 7th standard. then. You could undergo a training program and then become a school teacher. So, relatively speaking, Abdul Qadir was richer than Basheer, the author. So, as soon as Basheer saw his brother, he borrowed some money for a cup of tea and snacks. He was downright hungry. He went without food for days together, drinking only plain water. So this is not the kind of romantic tales that people tell you of having lived in Mumbai, surviving only on water. No, this was real. And he often owed his landlord a big amount by way of rent. So sometimes well-wishers, his fans would treat him to lunch or tea, but that was rare. So as soon as he saw Abdul Qadir, he borrowed some money and went out to have some tea. When he came back, he saw something ghastly had happened. Abdul Qadir had taken up a newspaper in which one of his stories was published, and he was marking certain sentences in red ink. And Basheer was angry, but Abdul Qadir said, brother, where is the predicate in this sentence? Subject and predicate. Predicate is called Akhyadam in Malayalam. Idile Akhyadam evide. So Basheer remarks, Endha Akhyadam? He didn't know what a predicate was, nor what a subject was. So he read the sentence again and he says, style and vajagama. It was a stylish sentence. Okay. Because Basheer was a stylist, a man, a writer who had a distinct style of his own. Okay. Whose style was remarkable. Okay. Quite often more remarkable than the content, what he wrote. He was a great stylist. So, despite being a great stylist, Abdul Qadir found fault with his grammar. So, this grammaticality, which many critics insist upon, was anathema to Basheer. He didn't like it. Why should I write grammatically? So, Basheer says elsewhere that for a long time he didn't know some of the alphabets of Malayalam. Yet, he went on to become a great writer. That's why I said he is an untutored muse. So, this kind of aversion for grammar, not grammar exactly, aversion for conventional grammar. You can't say that Basheer's sentences are ungrammatical. They are unconventional, right? So, a school teacher would find fault with them, but not a good reader of fiction. So, this is actually a crucial issue in literature. Whether it is better to be grammatical or creative. And many people have said this, that creative people often violate conventional grammar, which is exactly what Basheer did. Okay. Violating conventional grammar. Okay. But using the resources of the language like nobody else did. Right. So, this again is a crucial issue in Pathumma's Good. Okay. And as you read along, as you go along, you find more such issues coming up. Okay. Like, for instance, how do you bring up children? Okay. How do you cultivate good relationships in the family? Okay. So, while all these humorous things are being said, Basheer doesn't forget to tell us that occasionally at night, okay, he used to sleep in a big veranda with his brothers, sometimes his brother-in-law, and of course Umma. And they used to have long conversations into the night, you know. So such a thing is very rare. Okay. So despite the wranglings in the family, despite the quarrels, okay, of course there were plenty. When Pathumma's goat gave birth to 2 kids, Pathumma appeared to be a very stingy woman. She didn't give any milk even for the children in the household. She sold them. She had a justification for it. She said she would point to her thatched house, which did not even have a good door. So she was also poor. And her husband was also just doing odd jobs, selling trifles in the market. So, and they had a daughter called Khadija. Okay. So, such things happen. And there is a humorous incident in which Hanifa and Abu say that they will be filing a case against Pathumma. Okay. And because Pathumma treated some of her relatives to a feast to celebrate the goat giving birth to kids. And then the guest did not include Hanifa or Abu. So they said they'll file a civil case against her. And then this incident snowballs, and finally Pathumma says, okay, I'll give some milk for the children in the household to drink. Okay. And it did not stop at that. So without her knowledge, her sister-in-law started milking the goat. Finally, they were caught, and there was a big brouhaha in the household. So quarrels, wranglings, all the others are happening. But also there are family meetings like this. Okay. Conversations on how the children can be looked after better, how they can be given better food, you know. And there is a very painful description of how the household went on. It appears that only men and children had proper lunch. Okay. The women did not have even a proper lunch. So what did they eat? They often ate boiled dried tapioca. And they never drank a cup of good tea. Very rarely they would drink black tea without sugar. Okay. So you can guess how. So this household described in Pathumma's goat is a typical lower middle class household in Kerala during the middle of the century. Struggling. Okay. But there is mention about all the children going to school. So a forward-looking family, but struggling. You know, where even the women did not have anything. So how women are marginalized, how women become victims. Okay. So Hanifa, as I said, was a lazy bum. He didn't work properly. And if somebody chastised him, if somebody called him to account, he would say, oh, don't say such things. I'll join the army. So every time he used to say this. One day his wife said, okay, you can go to the army, but I'll follow you to the army. I'll also join the army. Okay, I can cook for the soldiers, he would say. And one day when he said this, the narrator said, wait, you can join the army half an hour later. I want you to tell me what you did with that good shirt of mine. He was very indiscriminate in his dress. He would take anybody else's shirt or mund and wear them. So this is a struggling family. A struggling family which was finding it very difficult to make both ends meet, but a united family. Okay. And a family which shared the resources of its members. So I already told you about how the author shared the things that he got. So sharing things, okay, sharing resources. This is one of the central themes of the novel. How you learn to do this, how you learn to share things, how you learn to share resources. Okay. So so on the one hand, you have a typical lower middle class family, just above the level of workers, proletariat family, lower middle class family, consisting of members who are finding it difficult to survive, where women don't have enough to eat, where children don't have good clothes to wear. So it's a struggle, it's a big struggle. So beneath the humor, what lies on the surface is the humor in the novel. Beneath the surface, you find sadder things, things which are not so good. Okay. So this has to be seen. So and Bashir doesn't forget to bring in everything. Okay, finally, we also find that although this is a Muslim family, we know there are absolutely no descriptions about Muslim rituals. Interestingly, probably there is some mention about Ummah doing namaz in the morning. I'm not very sure. Other than that, there is nothing. There is no mention about people going to the mosque on Friday. There is no mention about children going to the madrasa. And more importantly, although the family is the center of the narrative, lies at the center of the narrative, there are a number of non-Muslim characters who are as important as the major characters in the novel. Kuttan Pilla, the postman. Okay. So when he gets a money order, in those days you get money through money order, postal money order. His brothers had asked, his brothers had asked the postman to tell them beforehand if he had a money order, so that they could borrow money from him. And when the author came to know about it, he once when Kutambula brought a money order, he told him, in that case you can take all the money. I won't have a paisa left by evening, because everybody will borrow money from me. So Kutambula is an important character. The neighbor from whom the author brought a small sapling to plant in his compound of Jambaka. Okay. So now it was a big tree and there were plenty of fruit on it. And his mother used to sell them. And occasionally his nephews used to tell them in the market. Okay. So for a quarter of an anna, you will get 10 Jambaka. So there is another interesting event related to this Jambaka. So as the author sat in the veranda every day, he would see schoolgirls passing along, and they appeared to look at the author. Okay. And he thought, oh, they are looking at the famous writer, Vaikom Muhammad Basheer. So this belief of his received a beating when sometime later a girl came in to ask for some Jambakas. Her name was Suhasini. She was a 9th standard student in the school. So the author was disillusioned. They were not looking at him, but at the Jambaka tree. So he was happy that she had read some of his works, it appeared. So very happily he plucked some Jambaka and gave them to her. So this self-negation, okay, denying himself or making fun of himself, this is very common in Basheer's works. You can say this is a carnivalesque trait in his works. How he created characters from the countryside, how he mocked at himself. He has, in a number of his stories and narratives, he mocks at his figure, his bald head. So in Pathummayude Adu also you find the same kind of attitude. So this Jambaka incident is interesting that way. He doesn't elevate himself into the status of a great writer. He makes fun of himself. It's a trait which you find commonly in Basheer. Right. So the story ends in an anticlimax. This doesn't have a proper structure. Yeah, it doesn't have a proper structure. There is no climax. There is no beginning and end. So it's just a series of episodes strung together. So that's again another way in which Pathummayude Adu stops short of becoming a conventional novel. It's not a conventional novel because it doesn't have a hero, for one thing. You can loosely call Pathummayude's goat as the heroine. Yeah, Pathummayude Adu. There is no proper heroine. There is no love affair. Nothing. The narrator himself cannot claim to be the heroine. He is a silent spectator. So that way itself, there was no such novel in Malayalam at that time. No beginning, no end, no climax. So how does the novel end? Because it ends after the episode in which his sister-in-law's milk Pathumma's goat secretly without Pathumma knowing. So by using a very interesting trick, okay, by creating a figure of the lamb, okay, goat kid, okay, and placing it near the goat. So when you milk animals, if they have their kids or lambs or calves near, they produce more milk. Okay, milking becomes easier. So this was a trick they played. Okay, once it is said that one of the children was dressed up as a goat. So the novel ends with Basheer asking this question: who thought of this idea first? Ee buddhi aarkanu aadyam thoniyathu? Okay, and remember, the second title of the novel is The Wit of Women. Pathummayude Adu അല്ലെങ്കിൽ പെണ്ണുങ്ങളുടെ ബുദ്ധി എന്ന കഥയാണ് ഞാൻ പറയാൻ പോകുന്നത്. I'm going to narrate a story which can be called Pathumma's Goat or The Wisdom of Women or Women's Wits. Yeah. So I have given you I have opened some windows into the novel. You can find out much more as you read along. Thank you.